You know, when you're driving down a long, hot highway in the middle of summer.
Oh, yeah, when the heat is just radiating off the asphalt.
Exactly, yeah. And way up ahead, you see this, like, perfectly sharp, distinct line of water reflecting across the road.
Right, but it's a mirage.
Yeah, it's a mirage. Because the closer you get to it, the blurrier it becomes, right? Until you're basically right on top of it, and the line just vanishes entirely into this uh, wavy, distorted heat.
Which is funny because the human brain just loves to project these clean boundaries from a distance, but, physics rarely cooperates up close.
It really doesn't. And welcome to this deep dive, where today we're actually looking at another famous mirage.
A very common one, yeah.
Right, the supposedly simple, elementary school line between fact and opinion.
Yep.
From a distance, it looks perfectly sharp. But the closer you get, the blurrier and, frankly, the more heavily contested it actually is.
And distinguishing between the two is, it's far more than just some philosophical parlor trick. It is a high-stakes survival skill for, navigating modern media without being totally manipulated.
Oh, absolutely.
And for those of you listening who are heading into healthcare, it's actually a specific, rigorously tested competency. You will see this heavily featured on nursing entrance exams like the TEAS.
Which is the Test of Essential Academic Skills by ATI, right?
Right, exactly. And also the HESI A2, which is the exam produced by Elsevier.
So the mission for you, the listener, today is to completely demystify this boundary. We want to show you how to spot the psychological traps that test writers use, and more importantly, how to protect your own reasoning.
Yeah, but to even begin analyzing the tricky stuff, we really need to map out the baseline. Like, what are the actual textbook definitions of these two concepts?
Right, let's start there.
So, the entire foundation rests on this concept of verifiability. A fact is a statement whose truth can, in principle, be checked against evidence. It can be measured, observed, counted, or verified through an independent, repeatable process. And crucially, a factual statement remains the exact same, regardless of who's doing the checking.
Or how they feel about the outcome, I assume.
Exactly.
Meaning it exists entirely outside of the speaker's internal state. It's just out there in the world. So then what about an opinion?
Well, an opinion expresses a judgment or an evaluation, a preference, an interpretation. It basically cannot be settled by evidence alone because it ultimately depends on the values or priorities or the perspective of the person making the claim.
I mean, that seems straightforward enough. That's the sharp line on the highway in the distance.
Right, from a distance.
But when you actually sit down to apply these definitions, say, under the ticking clock of a nursing entrance exam, the illusion of that crisp line just shatters almost instantly.
It really does. And I think we tend to conflate the word fact with the concept of absolute truth, which causes massive confusion. The distinction between fact and truth is arguably the biggest stumbling block for people. A fact doesn't actually have to be proven true to be categorized as a fact.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it just has to be checkable. So take the statement, the Titanic sank on April 15th, 1912.
Okay.
You weren't there, I wasn't there, but it functions as a fact because we can verify it. We can check passenger manifests, wireless logs, survivor testimony.
Right. But let me push back on how we use that label, though. Are you saying a statement can be completely demonstrably wrong, but still be categorized as a fact?
Well, I would phrase it slightly differently. It remains a factual type claim. Think about the solar system.
Okay, sure.
For decades, students were taught the statement, Pluto is the 9th planet.
Oh, right, yeah. I remember that.
Right. And then in 2006, astronomers reclassified Pluto based on new criteria for planetary mass and orbit. So the original statement was updated because it turned out to be technically incorrect. But the statement, Pluto is the 9th planet, was always a factual claim.
Why? Because it was open to being checked?
Exactly. Being checkable, rather than eternally correct, is the defining feature. Facts aren't always true, and opinions aren't always false.
Well, that makes sense.
Right. If I say chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream, that isn't a false statement, it's just an opinion because best is a subjective metric. You can't put best in a beaker and measure its universal truth value in a lab.
I see the distinction. It's the structural shape of the statement. Being like fact-shaped means it is vulnerable to verification, whether it currently passes or fails that verification test.
Exactly. And that structural vulnerability leads to a really brilliant trap that exam writers love to set. It revolves around what happens when someone actually quotes a subjective judgment.
Oh, the reported opinion trap.
Yes. Let's say you're reading a passage for a reading comprehension test, and it says, the senator said the new policy was a disaster. If the test asks you to categorize that specific sentence, you might immediately assume it's an opinion.
Because the word disaster is a clear value judgment.
Exactly. The content of what the senator said is absolutely an opinion, but the sentence on the page, that is a factual claim.
Because you can verify whether or not the senator actually uttered those words.
Yes, you can check the congressional transcript, you can pull the audio recording.
It's a very sneaky pivot, honestly. You really have to evaluate the framing of the sentence, not just the juicy quote smuggled inside the frame.
And test raters for the TEAS and HESI exploit this cognitive blind spot constantly. They will quote someone's highly controversial opinion and then ask if the sentence in the passage is fact or opinion. The rule to remember is that reporting that someone stated an opinion is itself a verifiable fact.
That is such a good tip.
Yeah.
You know, you'd think that numbers, at least, provide an ultimate safe harbor from this kind of ambiguity.
You would think that.
Yeah, because we're culturally conditioned to just bow down to data. If there's a statistic involved, we tend to categorize the entire sentence as a rock-solid fact.
Numbers are incredibly persuasive, definitely, but they are just raw material. The adjectives surrounding the numbers are almost always doing the heavy lifting of smuggling in an opinion.
How so?
Well, if a hospital logs its internal timestamps, the statement, emergency department wait times at Hospital X averaged 42 minutes in 2019 is a checkable fact.
Right, but the moment the marketing department gets hold of it, the brochure says, Hospital X provides excellent emergency care, with wait times averaging only 42 minutes.
Bingo. The data is identical, but the nature of the claim has completely transformed. The number remains the fact, but the words excellent and only introduce an evaluative narrative.
Because to call the care excellent, someone has to establish a value benchmark.
Precisely. What counts as good performance? Are you weighing wait time against patient mortality rates? Or perhaps against staffing budgets? The moment you attach a descriptive adjective to raw data, you are telling a story.
Which introduces a major philosophical headache, honestly, because language just refuses to stay neatly in these isolated boxes. If adjectives smuggle in opinions, it implies we spend most of our lives operating in a blurry middle ground where facts and values are hopelessly tangled.
Oh, completely. And philosophers have actually spent decades attacking the idea that facts and values can be cleanly separated at all.
Like Hillary Putnam.
Yes. In 2002, Hillary Putnam published The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy. He pointed out that everyday human language relies on what he called thick words. These are terms like cruel, reckless, or healthy.
I always like to visualize Putnam's idea by thinking of language like a fruit smoothie.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you might start with factual, descriptive berries and evaluative, opinion-based bananas. But once you throw them in the blender and hit puree to create a word like cruel, you just cannot unblend the liquid back into a pure fact cup and a pure opinion cup.
Right.
The concept of cruelty inherently contains both an observable action and a moral condemnation.
That analogy perfectly captures his argument. These thick words are simultaneously descriptive and evaluative. And in a clinical context, which is obviously highly relevant for nursing exams, consider the act of calling a patient's wound infected.
Well, on the surface, infected sounds entirely factual.
Right, because it has measurable objective signs, redness, an elevated white blood cell count, and what clinicians call purulent drainage.
Which is the medical term for the discharge of a pus, right?
Exactly, and you can run a lab culture to test for it, but Putnam would argue that the word infected is also inherently evaluative. It functions as a warning.
Oh, because it's a judgment that something has gone wrong with the organism.
Yes, and it demands an immediate clinical intervention. It blends objective biological measurement with a value-laden judgment about what counts as healthy versus harmful.
Man, this collapse of the dichotomy must be an absolute nightmare for modern fact-checkers. Organizations like PolitiFact are built entirely on the premise that they can police a definitive line between fact and fiction.
Oh, they face a nearly impossible task. Politicians rarely speak in pure mathematical variables. They almost exclusively use thick, blended words.
So when a fact-checker rates a value judgment as false, they risk injecting their own subjective opinion into what is supposed to be a neutral, objective verdict.
Precisely. The line they're trying to police is fundamentally porous, which is why their rulings are endlessly debated.
But if the boundary is so porous and words are so easily blended, why did we ever start obsessing over separating facts and opinions in the first place? Historically speaking, where did this intense need to categorize them even originate?
Well, the roots stretch back to 1739, with the Scottish philosopher David Hume and his work A Treatise of Human Nature.
Okay, taking us back.
Yeah. Hume identified a logical sleight of hand happening in philosophical and political writing. Authors would spend pages making descriptive statements about what is like, cataloging the state of the world, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, they would start making prescriptive statements about what people ought to do.
Ah, the famous is-ought problem, often referred to as Hume's guillotine.
That's the one. Hume's guillotine is essentially a logical boundary. It states that descriptive facts, no matter how high you pile them up, cannot magically generate a value judgment without an invisible leap of logic.
Let's ground that in a concrete example for you listening. We can establish a biological checkable fact. Smoking causes cellular mutations that lead to lung cancer. That is the is. But to reach the conclusion that people ought not smoke, we have to cross a bridge.
Right. To cross that bridge, you require an additional value premise. You have to fundamentally believe that physical longevity matters more than temporary pleasure or personal autonomy or the relief of addiction.
Wow.
The scientific data can confirm the cancer risk, but no biological fact in the universe can supply the moral judgment that extending lifespan is the ultimate human good. The value has to be supplied by the observer.
So Hume literally severs the is from the ought. But the obsession with separating them really accelerates after World War I, doesn't it?
It does, largely driven by a group in the 1920s and 30s called the Vienna Circle, led by Moritz Schlick. These were the logical positivists.
And you really have to remember the historical context here. The world had just witnessed the catastrophic destruction of the First World War, which was driven by nationalistic ideologies and sweeping, unverifiable rhetoric.
Exactly. They were looking for an anchor, something solid and rational to prevent that kind of ideological madness from ever taking over again.
So they wanted to draw a concrete border between rigorous, objective science and, well, everything else.
They championed what they called the verification principle, which dictated that a statement only possesses cognitive meaning, meaning it actually has semantic substance and relates to reality if you can empirically test it.
And if you couldn't?
If a statement couldn't be tested, like claims about ethics, aesthetics, or religion, the Vienna Circle considered it literally meaningless nonsense.
Which is wild. The British philosopher A.J. Ayer took this to a fascinating extreme in 1936 with his Bourah theory, right?
Oh, yes.
According to Ayer, if I stand up and declare stealing is wrong, I'm not actually making a structural claim about the universe or human society. I'm essentially just booing for the opposing sports team.
Under Ayer's extreme positivist framework, moral and evaluative statements are stripped of all factual weight. They are reduced to mere expressions of your personal emotional approval or disapproval, just dressed up in the grammatical structure of a sentence. Boo stealing! Hurrah, charity!
It's highly ironic. The philosophers reduced human morality to the equivalent of cheering for a sports team. And yet, a few decades later, the American education system decided this blurry, philosophically fraught distinction was a rigid, objective skill that could be graded on standardized tests.
Yeah, by the mid-20th century, reading comprehension really shifted. Educators recognized that students needed to do more than mechanically decode vocabulary. They needed to analyze an author's intent and detect manipulation.
Right.
So mapping the difference between subjective impression and objective data eventually became formally embedded into public education, peaking with the Common Core State Standards in 2010.
Which brings us to the actual real-world consequences of all this. Understanding the philosophical history explains why the TEAS exam tests this skill, but failing to distinguish fact from opinion in the real world is far more dangerous than failing a multiple-choice question.
Absolutely.
A major vulnerability is our reliance on consensus.
Test writers frequently use phrases like, everyone agrees that, or it is widely accepted that, as distractors, but popularity is not a mechanism for verification.
Right, because for over 1,000 years, the overwhelming global consensus was geocentrism, the absolute belief that the Earth sat at the center of the universe. The consensus was universal, and it was factually wrong.
There is also a brilliant modern example of how repetition manufactures a fact. The War of the Worlds radio, broadcast by Orson Welles on October 30, 1938.
Oh, the alien invasion panic.
Yes. For decades, it has been cited as a historical fact that Wells's fictional Martian invasion caused a nationwide mass panic. The story goes that millions of people fled cities and jammed emergency switchboards.
But when media historians Jefferson Pooley and Michael Socolow actually investigated the data, they found the mass panic was a manufactured fact.
Completely manufactured.
Newspapers, which were terrified of radio stealing their advertising revenue, heavily exaggerated, isolated incidents, just to discredit the new medium. But because the story of the panic was repeated so relentlessly, it bypassed our verification filters and solidified into established history.
Our vulnerability to repetition is definitely concerning, but the psychology behind how we evaluate information is even more unsettling. Which brings us to a landmark 2018 study by the Pew Research Center on News Literacy.
Now, it's really important to note how Pew set this study up. They presented thousands of U.S. adults with highly polarized political statements from across the ideological spectrum.
Right.
And just to be completely clear to you listening, our goal here is not to endorse any political viewpoint or take sides on the statements they used in the study. We are strictly reporting on the scientific finding of how the human brain processed the information during the experiment.
Definitely. So the researchers asked participants to simply categorize the statements as either fact or opinion. The results revealed a systemic failure in media literacy. Only about 25% of respondents correctly identified all the factual statements, and roughly a third correctly identified all the opinion statements.
But the critical takeaway wasn't just the low success rate, was it? It was the psychological mechanism behind how the participants failed.
Exactly. The errors were not random. The researchers found a massive correlation. People were highly likely to categorize a statement as factual if it aligned with their pre-existing beliefs.
Wow.
Conversely, they categorized statements as opinion when they disagreed with them, completely ignoring the structural verifiability of the sentence.
It's like everyone is walking around wearing prescription-tinted glasses.
Yeah.
You literally cannot see the fact label on a statement unless that statement perfectly matches your personal prescription.
That is a great way to put it.
This is driven by what psychologists call identity protective cognition. When we encounter a verifiable fact that threatens our worldview, our brain treats it as a physical threat. To protect our identity, we demote the inconvenient fact to the status of just an opinion.
Which tells us that failing to distinguish fact from opinion is rarely a deficit of intelligence or reading comprehension. It is almost always a bias problem. We elevate our own subjective values to the status of objective truth, and we dismiss actual data as mere bias.
And if you carry that cognitive bias into a clinical setting, it doesn't just skew your worldview, it can literally end your career and harm patients. This is exactly why the principles we've discussed are foundational to clinical documentation, specifically the SOA note.
Yes, the SOAP note. In the 1960s, Dr. Lawrence Weed at the University of Vermont revolutionized medical charting by creating the problem-oriented medical record. This structure gave us the SOP note subjective-objective assessment plan.
The genius of the SOA note is that it forces the clinician to physically separate subjective experience from verifiable data. The S stands for subjective. This is what the patient reports, which obviously cannot be independently verified by the clinician. For example, charting patient states their pain is an 8 out of 10.
And then the O is objective, the verifiable, measurable facts, like patient's blood pressure is 148/92.
And nursing students are explicitly trained that they must never chart their own judgmental opinions in these sections. You cannot write that a patient is difficult, uncooperative, or drug-seeking.
Because those are evaluative, thick words, they aren't verifiable. If you chart a subjective judgment, you create a massive legal liability because a lawyer can argue you provided biased care.
Not to mention, it biases the next clinician who reads the chart.
Exactly, potentially leading to a misdiagnosis. Clinical assessments are evidence-based, informed judgments, but they must be meticulously extracted from the pure objective data. It is a defensible in-court habit.
Well, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, from mirages and logical positivists to identity protective cognition and medical charting. So instead of just a basic summary, let's frame the 5 key takeaways from our deep dive as cognitive defense mechanisms. These are the tools you need to navigate both standardized exams and modern media.
I love that. Defense mechanism 1, checkability over accuracy. A fact is verifiable, an opinion is arguable. If you can't test a statement against external evidence, it remains an opinion, regardless of the speaker's confidence.
Defense mechanism 2. Consensus is an illusion of proof. Phrases like everyone knows or experts agree do not magically transform an unverifiable claim into a fact.
Defense mechanism 3. The framing effect. Remember that reporting an opinion is a verifiable act. If a passage states, "She said the movie was terrible," the fact is that the words were spoken, not that the movie was actually terrible.
Right. Defense mechanism 4. Data requires isolation. Numbers are facts, but the adjectives used to deliver them are almost always opinions. 42 minutes is verifiable data. Excellent wait time is a value judgment.
And defense mechanism 5, identify the signal flares. Words like best, worst, should, beautiful, and terrible are evaluative terms that instantly mark a statement as an opinion.
Mastering these mechanisms also unlocks your ability to understand neighboring concepts on these exams, like identifying an author's tone, spotting confirmation bias, and evaluating how evidence is actually used to support claims.
Because the friction between fact and opinion is where all genuine critical thinking occurs. It forms
Which is basically an evidence-based guess.
right.
An inference that's right in that blurry middle ground is the invisible cognitive bridge that connects raw data to a final judgment. Next time you read a medical chart, a news article, or even listen to a politician speak, try to spot the inferences. Look for those invisible bridges. It might just make you wonder, how many of your own deeply held core beliefs are actually just well-disguised inferences, rather than the rock-solid, verifiable facts you thought they were?
It requires a certain kind of intellectual bravery to step closer to the mirage and willingly watch the crisp lines blur.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the boundaries, keep verifying the evidence, and we will catch you next time.